higher merit in terms of what they look at like on paper. .com and .net are not necessarily great. .org is kind of in the middle, right? Accuracy is our second A, right? So then when you actually get to the point of saying, okay, it's relevant, it's current, the author is credible, now the information itself, is it accurate, right? Is it truthful? Is it correct? Because again, you can have somebody that has credentials, but they might put up something that's full of propaganda, right? There are people who have, degrees, they look great on paper, but they're trying to push an agenda. So you have to, again, verify that the information is good. You need to check and look at how have they presented the information in terms of just, is it proofread? Has it got correct grammar and mechanics? It doesn't have to be perfect, but if you see consistent problems with grammar, and punctuation, and obviously no proofreading, then you got to wonder just how detail-oriented the person was who wrote the whole thing, right? If they're sloppy about that stuff, right? Now, obviously, if it's someone that's English as a second language, you might give them a little bit of leeway. But again, if you're going to put something up professionally, then you find somebody, if you don't know yourself, to be able to proofread and edit to make it as perfect as possible. Another thing is, again, look at the type of language and tone, right? Are they biased or is it free of emotion, right? If, read it and really take a step back and say, okay, how are they trying to persuade me here? Are they really trying to make me feel bad and guilty or angry? And okay, and is there really something to be guilty or angry about, right? So consider the source, right? Consider, just, can I trust this site? And then the last letter P is for purpose. Why does the information exist? And I think this kind of keys a little bit off this idea of bias, right? Remember, I always ask you in your outlines to tell me what your purpose is. Why are you writing about this? What do you want the outcome to be after someone reads this paper? That is a consistent, if somebody's going to put information up on the internet, right, or they're going to publish it in a book or a magazine, then they have a reason to do that, right? Sometimes it's a pretty esoteric kind of thing, right? If you're in my field and you work at a four-year university, you just got to publish stuff because that's part of making sure your academic credentials are relevant, blah, 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 right? And so, there's a lot of really boring, dull, uninspiring articles written in academia because a lot of these people don't really have a purpose other than just to check off a box so that they're fulfilling their contract, right? But other people actually, again, you can see here, they might want to just inform, they might want to teach, to sell, to entertain, to persuade. So think about what's going on there, right? And are they upfront about this, or are they kind of sly about it, right? Because that's, that might be an important thing about the author's credibility, their trustworthiness, if they're trying to trick me, right? And again, are we looking at fact or opinion? And then if it's either of these, has it been slanted anyway, right? So propaganda is where the author, it's not good or bad, right? Propaganda is a neutral term, and we talk about that a lot more in Comp 2. But, somebody can twist things to try to get a particular response, right? If you've ever watched an animal shelter commercial, right? They always have some really, really sad music, and they're showing these pictures of animals that look in pain or lonely or cold or something. They're really, trying to make us feel horrible, trying to just feel guilty, us to feel outraged that these animals are treated that way, because they know that's more likely to trigger us to do something, to give money, right? So that's propaganda being used for a positive method, as long as when you give money to that organization, they actually use it to help animals, right? But other people use propaganda just because they think we're easy to manipulate, and they really just want something from us that's good for them, but it's not necessarily good for anybody else. And then related to that is, again, is it objective and impartial, or is it biased, right? And so again, we look at the discussion, when I define what kind of sources, I say academic, credible, right, objective, right? And then again, do you see any kind of religious, political, ideological, cultural, institutional, or personal biases? Again, this alone does not necessarily mean that the information isn't good, but you have to consider that and then say, okay, if I put that in this paper with this purpose for this audience, is that going to be something that might harm me? Is that going to be the best approach? Or do I need to find another source that doesn't have such a big agenda, right? Because there are some people, some organizations that people have an automatic response to. And that if you use something from them, that reader just might shut down because they don't trust that source, right? So you've got to think about those things when you're choosing sources. Don't just take the first thing that you find on the internet, right? Take precise notes. You don't want to, write something down and then not be able to find where you got it from. That happened to me, and it's so frustrating. So again, you can do a real formal thing where you're using note cards. You can type. You can take pictures with your phone of a page where, as long as it's also clear what the source is, not just the page, right? Prepare to do a lot of reading. Usually when you're doing really formal research, you probably read 3 or 4 times the amount of what you actually end up putting in a paper for a really long paper. Because again, remember that previously they talked about, on that crap test, they talked about, you got to make sure that what you found actually has merit, and you sometimes can't tell that unless you go and read what other people are saying, right? And so again, do more reading than what you actually need. And again, here I'm talking about, how do you handle things like reading books and articles? If you're having to read like 20 things, researchers don't generally read the entire work when they're just trying to find out if they could use the book, right, or the magazine. With books, what we do is we look for keywords like in the table of contents or in the index at the back, right? We look at maybe if they're chapter titles as opposed to just chapter numbers. We look at those chapter titles and see, there's particular chapters that are about specific things. And then we go to those chapters, and that's where we look at to see if there's anything relevant. And once we find that, yeah, that sounds good, then we might read the introduction or the first chapter, and then wherever the person has gotten their conclusions, and obviously look at the author. For articles, you probably want to, if it's an APA styled article that has abstract and literature review and methodology and all of that, I would say read the abstract and then read their purpose statement, which is going to be right after the abstract. You're going to see an introduction that kind of says the purpose of this essay is, and then go to the end and read their conclusions, because all of that stuff in the middle isn't necessarily anything that you need. You don't necessarily need to know what statistical formula they use to get the data that they're using, right? You don't need to know necessarily the list of questions they asked people that they surveyed. You don't necessarily need to know all of the things that a survey of literature is just talking about. Here are the articles and books that we looked at that were helpful, right? They give a little survey of it, right? You don't necessarily need that unless that's part of what you need to look at, right? And so that's again, articles, sometimes that's all you need to read there. So again, you don't have to sit down and read cover to cover. Never forget your purpose, right? Your purpose may change. Part of writing is evolving. And so but again, keep your mind on what you're meant to do and make sure that everything you put in that paper is consistent with that. Don't forget the MLA, right? Okay, so list of non-credible and non-academic sources. Blogs are not necessarily uncredible or unacademic, but there are so many blogs out there that are just personal opinion that sometimes it's really hard to tell if you've got a good blog, one that's worthy. So if you find something that is a blog, and oftentimes the word blog will be in the title of the URL, or there'll be blog on the title of the page, but also just the way something is set up. Usually like there'll be like a little column here that has like links to other articles that the person has, and they'll be like just, it looks like a blog entry, right? Day, time, and then there'll be something else underneath it and another one underneath it, right? An article will just take up the whole page, right? So if you think you've got something that is credible, you do the crap test and all that, then send me the link and I'll let you know if you can use it or not. If you use a blog in your paper that you have not sent me for approval, then I'll strike that off your works cited list and you will not get credit for that source. So if you only have 3 sources and you take that off, then you've not met the research, right? So it is very important that you understand what I'm saying here so that you don't fall into a trap and end up hurting yourself, right? User-generated content sites, these are things like Reddit, Quora, Suite 101, Find Articles. I've just listed, there are just hundreds of these. Again, not all of these user-generated content sites are bad, but the problem with them is that they're inconsistent.